The sun hung low over Delta City, painting the sky in soft hues of orange and pink, but Jacob felt none of its warmth. He sat by the edge of his crumbling hut, staring out at the distant waters, his stomach gnawing at him with a hunger he could no longer ignore. His fishing nets lay empty, his traps untouched by even the smallest of fish. For weeks, the rivers had been unkind and the marketplace was no better. Prices had soared and Jacob had nothing to trade. His daughter Victoria sat quietly inside, her tiny frame too weak for an 8-year-old. She hadn't spoken much that day and Jacob couldn't blame her. Hunger had stolen her words, just as it had stolen her smile. The sight of her frail body broke something inside him. He couldn't let her starve. As twilight deepened, Jacob's mind turned to the Forbidden River, a place whispered about only in fear. The elders of Delta City told stories of its shimmering glow, of how it pulsed like a living thing breathing danger into the air. They said it was cursed home to spirits who despised mortals. No one who ventured there returned unchanged if they returned at all. But hunger had a way of dulling fear. Jacob stared at the horizon, where the Forbidden River lay hidden behind thick trees. The thought of disobeying the warnings made his chest tighten, but desperation clouded his judgment. "I have no choice," he muttered to himself, grabbing his fishing rod and an old lantern. The path to the Forbidden River was overgrown and treacherous. Twisting vines clutched at his legs, and the shadows of the forest seemed to stretch and move as if alive. Crickets sang an uneasy tune, and an owl's hoot pierced the air, making Jacob's heart race. So he pressed on. When he reached the river, he froze. It was unlike anything he had ever seen. The water shimmered with an unnatural glow, lighting up the surrounding trees in ghostly hues. Mist clung to its surface, swirling like smoke, and the air felt heavier here as though the river itself was watching him. For a moment Jacob hesitated. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to leave the river and its glow behind. But then he thought of Victoria's hollow cheeks, of her fragile hands gripping his shirt as she asked, "Papa, when will we eat again?" With trembling hands, Jacob cast his line into the water. It didn't take long. The line jerked violently and Jacob almost let go of the rod in surprise. He braced himself, pulling with all his might. Whatever was on the other end was strong, too strong to be any fish he had caught before. Sweat dripped down his face as he wrestled with the line, his muscles straining against the pull. Finally, with a mighty heave, Jacob brought it to shore. His breath caught in his throat. It was a fish, but unlike any he had ever seen. Its body shimmered like the river itself, with scales that glowed in shifting colors: blue, green, and gold. Its eyes were large and unsettling, almost human-like, and its tail was long and graceful, with intricate patterns that seemed too deliberate to be natural. For a moment, Jacob felt an icy chill crawl up his spine. The stories of the Forbidden River echoed in his mind, but hunger drowned them out. "This will feed us," he whispered. He didn't think twice as he wrapped the fish in his net and turned to leave. Back at his hut, Jacob worked quickly. The fish's glowing scales seemed to dim under the light of his lantern, and its once mesmerizing beauty now felt eerie. But Jacob pushed aside his unease. He gutted the fish, its insides glistening with an otherworldly sheen, and prepared it for cooking. The aroma filled the small hut, rich and intoxicating. Victoria stirred from her corner, her eyes widening at the sight of food. "Papa, is it safe to eat?" she asked weakly, her voice trembling. "It's just fish," Jacob replied, forcing a smile. "Eat, my child." They shared the meal, the taste unlike anything Jacob had ever experienced. It was rich and savory, each bite filling his body with warmth. For the first time in weeks he felt full, and Victoria's face lit up with a small, tired smile. But as the night deepened, the air inside the hut grew colder. Jacob's dreams that night were restless and strange. He found himself standing by the Forbidden River, the glowing water swirling violently. From its depths emerged figures, their eyes glowing like lanterns in the dark. Their bodies were covered in shimmering scales, and their cries were haunting, melodic, and filled with sorrow. "Why did you take her?" a voice echoed, deep and mournful. Jacob turned to run, but the figures surged forward, their hands clawing at him, their cries growing louder until they became unbearable. He woke with a start, drenched in sweat, his chest heaving. For a moment he sat still, trying to calm his racing heart. But then he noticed something strange. His skin, usually rough and weathered, was covered in fine, colorful scales. They shimmered faintly in the moonlight, and his legs throbbed with a pain that felt unnatural, as though they were trying to change. "Papa!" Victoria's voice broke through his panic. He turned to her, but she shrank back, her eyes wide with fear. "What's happening to you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Jacob looked down at himself, his breath catching in his throat. The glowing scales had spread further, and his legs ached so fiercely that he could barely stand. He staggered to the door, ignoring Victoria's frightened cries. Outside, the village was quiet, but Jacob knew it wouldn't stay that way. Whatever was happening to him couldn't be hidden for long. And deep down he knew this was only the beginning. Jacob wandered through the darkened streets of Delta City, his breath shallow and unsteady. The pain in his legs was growing worse, each step sending jolts through his body. He stumbled, falling to his knees, and gritted his teeth to suppress a cry. He dared not wake the villagers. "Why is this happening?" he whispered, clutching at his legs. The fine, colorful scales shimmered faintly under the moonlight, spreading slowly but surely up his thighs. His skin was no longer his own, and fear crept into his heart like a poison. It wasn't long before the first rays of dawn broke through the sky. The village stirred to life, and Jacob knew he couldn't stay hidden. He limped toward the riverbank, away from prying eyes, hoping to think, to understand, to fix whatever was happening to him. At the riverbank, Jacob knelt by the water, his reflection staring back at him. His face looked the same, but his arms and legs glistened with those unnatural scales. His toes had begun to merge, the skin webbing together as though they were becoming something not human. He clenched his fists, his mind racing. The dreams from the night before haunted him, the glowing eyes, the sorrowful voices, and their accusation. "Why did you take her? What have I done?" he murmured. The forbidden river was still in his mind, its eerie glow, the strange fish, and the meal he had shared with Victoria. His stomach churned as a dreadful realization began to form. That fish. It wasn't just a fish. The stories the elders had told about the forbidden river came flooding back to him. They spoke of spirits and creatures that lived beneath its surface, guardians of the mystical waters who punished those who trespassed. Could the glowing fish have been one of them? A being he had unknowingly killed and eaten? Jacob's heart pounded in his chest as the truth solidified in his mind. He had committed a sin beyond understanding, and now the river, or whatever powers ruled it, was exacting its vengeance. The villagers were the first to notice something was wrong. Jacob's once quiet existence became the subject of whispers and sideways glances. People saw the way he walked now, with a limp that grew more pronounced each day. Some claimed to have glimpsed the shimmer of scales on his skin, though Jacob had taken to wearing long clothes to hide his transformation. Rumors spread quickly. "Jacob has angered the spirits," one woman said, clutching her child. "He's cursed," another whispered. "Stay away from him." The fear grew, and soon so did the isolation. Children avoided him, running away when he passed. Friends who once greeted him warmly now crossed the street to avoid him. Even Victoria's friends stopped coming to visit. One evening, a group of elders came to Jacob's home. "We've heard the rumors," their leader said, his voice heavy with suspicion. "What have you done, Jacob? What curse have you brought upon yourself?" Jacob, desperate to protect himself and Victoria, denied everything. "It's nothing," he lied. "Just an illness. It will pass." But the elders weren't convinced. They left with grave expressions, their eyes filled with doubt. That night the dreams returned. This time they were worse. The glowing water churned violently, and the figures from the depths were clearer. Their faces were beautiful yet terrifying, their scaled bodies glistening as they moved. But there was one among them that caught Jacob's eye, a small figure, childlike, with the same shimmering scales as the fish he had caught. The child's eyes were wide with sorrow, and her mouth opened to speak, but her voice was drowned by the mournful wails of the others. Jacob woke with a gasp, his body drenched in sweat. His scales had spread further, reaching his chest, and his legs felt heavier than ever. He could barely move. Victoria stirred from her corner, her eyes wide with worry. "Papa, you're scaring me," she said, her voice trembling. Jacob looked at her, his heart breaking. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen." But his apology felt hollow. He had no answers, no solutions, and the weight of his actions pressed down on him like a stone. The villagers' fear turned to anger. When Jacob tried to trade for food at the market, people refused to serve him. "We don't want your curse spreading," one man spat. Jacob clenched his fists, but he said nothing. He turned and walked away, his head low. Back at his hut, Victoria sat quietly, her face pale. "Papa, are we going to be okay?" she asked, her voice small. Jacob knelt beside her, forcing a smile he didn't feel. "Of course, my child," he said, stroking her hair. "I'll fix this. I promise." But even as he spoke, the words felt like a lie. Desperation drove Jacob back to the forbidden river. Under the cover of darkness, he made his way through the forest, his heart pounding with fear and determination. The river glowed as it always had, its light dancing on the trees like ghostly flames. Jacob fell to his knees by the water's edge. "I'm sorry," he cried, his voice breaking. "I didn't know what I was doing. Please undo this curse." The river remained silent, its surface calm and unyielding. Jacob's cries grew louder, more desperate. "Please. I'll do anything." For a moment nothing happened. Then the water began to ripple, the glow intensifying. A chilling wind swept through the forest, carrying with it the faint sound of mournful cries. Jacob's heart raced as the water turned violently. Something was coming, something that would change everything. And for the first time Jacob truly understood. There would be no easy forgiveness. The days that followed were a nightmare. Jacob's transformation was no longer something he could hide. The scales had spread across his entire body, glistening in the sunlight like the river's glow. His legs had begun to merge, his movements slow and unnatural. Each step felt like his body was betraying him, pulling him closer to something he didn't understand. The villagers' whispers turned into open hostility. Children pointed and screamed when they saw him. Adults crossed themselves or muttered prayers as they passed. The isolation was suffocating, but what broke Jacob the most was the look in Victoria's eyes, fear mixed with sorrow. She tried to be brave for him. "Papa, you'll get better," she said one morning, her voice trembling. Jacob smiled faintly, though his heart ached. He couldn't tell her the truth. He didn't know if he would survive this, much less return to the man he once was. That evening, the village council gathered near the town square. Jacob stood at the edge of the crowd, his hood pulled low over his head to hide his face, though it did little to mask the way people recoiled from him. "The curse cannot stay in our village," an elder declared, his voice sharp. "Jacob has brought this upon himself, and now we all suffer the consequences." The crowd murmured in agreement, their voices filled with anger and fear. "What if the spirits come for us next?" a woman cried. "We must drive him out," another shouted. Jacob stepped forward, his heart pounding. "Please," he said, his voice cracking. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I'll fix it, I'll find a way to fix it." But his words fell on deaf ears. "You've angered the spirits, Jacob," the elder said coldly. "This is beyond anything we can help you with. Leave before you bring more misfortune upon us all." The crowd roared its approval, and Jacob felt the weight of their hatred pressing down on him. That night, Jacob sat by the riverbank, his body trembling with exhaustion and despair. He had no home now, no community, and the transformation was almost complete. His legs were almost fully fused, and his skin glistened in the moonlight like that of a creature from the depths. Victoria sat beside him, her small hands clutching his arm. "Papa, where will we go?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jacob looked at her, tears welling in his eyes. "I don't know," he admitted. For the first time he felt truly helpless. The forbidden river called to him, its glow brighter than ever, but he didn't know if it held salvation or doom. As the days passed, Jacob's condition worsened. He could no longer walk, his legs now fully joined into a single tail-like appendage. The villagers avoided him entirely, their fear turning him into nothing more than a ghost in their midst. Victoria tried her best to care for him, bringing him what little food she could find. But it was clear that she was struggling. Her once bright eyes were dull with worry, and her small frame seemed even frilier than before. One afternoon, as Jacob lay by the riverbank, a shadow fell over him. He looked up to see a young boy no older than 12 staring at him with wide eyes. "You're the cursed man," the boy said bluntly. Jacob sighed, too tired to argue. "Yes, I am," he replied. The boy hesitated, then stepped closer. "Is it true you went to the forbidden river?" Jacob nodded. The boy knelt beside him, his curiosity outweighing his fear. "What's it like?" he asked. Jacob glanced at the glowing water, its light reflecting in the boy's eyes. "It's different," he said. "Beautiful and terrifying at the same time." The boy frowned as if trying to understand. "Why did you go there?" Jacob closed his eyes, the memory of that night heavy in his mind. "Because I was hungry," he said simply. The boy stared at him for a moment longer, then stood. Without another word, he walked away, leaving Jacob alone with his thoughts. That night the dreams came again. This time they were more vivid than ever. The glowing water churned violently and the spirits emerged once more. Their cries were louder, more piercing, and the childlike figure stepped forward again. "You took her from us," a voice echoed, deep and mournful. Jacob fell to his knees in the dream, tears streaming down his face. "I didn't know," he cried. "I didn't know what she was." The child's glowing eyes filled with sorrow and she raised a hand, pointing toward the river. "Come back," the voice said. "Face your sin." Jacob woke with a start, his heart pounding. The river's glow was brighter than ever, casting eerie shadows on the trees. He knew what he had to do. The following morning, Jacob called Victoria to his side. "I need to go back to the Forbidden River," he said, his voice steady despite the fear in his heart. Victoria's eyes widened. "Papa, no. It's too dangerous." "I don't have a choice," he replied. This thing that's happening to me, it started there. If there's any chance of ending it, I have to go back." Victoria's lip trembled and she clung to him tightly. "What if they hurt you?" Jacob stroked her hair gently. "They already have," he said softly. With a heavy heart, he prepared to return to the place where it had all begun. The Forbidden River awaited, its glow calling to him like a beacon. And Jacob knew, whatever fate awaited him there, he could no longer run from it. Jacob made his way back to the Forbidden River, his body heavy with dread. The once familiar path through the dense forest now felt like a maze, its dark shadows pressing in on him, suffocating him with their coldness. His legs no longer human pulsed with pain, the transformation now complete. His skin shimmered with iridescent scales, his once solid frame replaced by a tail that swayed beneath him, dragging along the forest floor. Each step he took felt like the last, and his mind was filled with nothing but the voices of those who had cast him aside, the villagers, his friends, even his daughter who had once looked at him with love but now feared him. Yet there was no turning back now. His heart ached as he thought of Victoria. He hadn't wanted her to see him like this, a creature of the river. But he had failed her. He had failed them both. And the only way to undo this curse was to return to the place where it all began, the Forbidden River. When Jacob finally reached the river, its eerie glow greeted him like an old acquaintance, yet its beauty no longer seemed comforting. The water churned restlessly, its surface trembling as if alive, reacting to his presence. The distant wails of mournful cries seemed to rise from the depths, filling the air with an unearthly sorrow. The figures began to emerge as if summoned by his arrival. At first it was just one, then two, and soon the water was alive with shimmering, otherworldly beings, mermaids, their bodies covered in scales that sparkled in the dim light. Their eyes glowed with a sorrow that sent shivers down Jacob's spine. They moved with an eerie grace, their long tails cutting through the water like whispers on the wind. But it wasn't the sight of the mermaids that caused Jacob's heart to stop, it was the child. She appeared from the depths, just like in his dreams. Her small figure glowed brighter than the rest, and her eyes, those large, sorrowful eyes, locked onto his. She was the same as the fish he had caught, the same as the creature he had slaughtered and eaten. And now she stood before him, her gaze filled with a sadness that Jacob could feel in his very soul. "You took her from us," the voice echoed, a mournful wail that seemed to come from the depths of the river itself. It wasn't just the child speaking, it was all of them. Every mermaid, every spirit who had risen from the water, was accusing him, blaming him for their pain. "I didn't know," Jacob whispered, his voice shaking. "I didn't know what she was. I thought she was just a fish. Please. I'm sorry." The child floated closer, her face pale and her features etched with the anguish of 1,000 lifetimes. "You killed her," she said softly. "You ate her. You stole her life." Jacob sank to his knees, his tail curling beneath him in a futile attempt to balance himself. "I didn't mean to," his voice faltered. "I was hungry. I was desperate. I never knew she was one of you." The river seemed to pulse with energy, the spirits closing in on him, their eyes glowing with a terrible intensity. "You have broken the sacred law. The voice of the child spoke again, though now it was joined by the deep, mournful wails of the other mermaids. You have defiled the river and now you must face the consequences. Jacob felt the weight of their words pressing down on him, suffocating him with a sense of guilt and terror. The pain in his legs intensified, and he could feel his body yearning to merge with the river, to become one with the water that had claimed so many before him. He could hear the voices of the spirits calling to him, beckoning him to join them in the depths. But Jacob knew this wasn't just a physical transformation, this was something deeper. His soul, his very essence, had been touched by the curse. The spirits were not just angry, they were seeking something more, something he could never give them. You must pay, the child said, her voice now an echo, blending with the cries of the other spirits. Return to the river, return to the depths, and become part of the curse you have created. Only then will we be at peace. Jacob looked down at his body, his hands trembling as he reached toward the water. The glowing scales on his arms flickered in the river's light, and the pain in his legs became unbearable, as though his body was being pulled by invisible forces, tugging him toward the water. He had no choice. Jacob felt a sudden urge to step into the river. It wasn't just the spirits calling to him, it was something within himself, something ancient and deep within his soul, telling him that this was the only way to end the suffering, to face the consequences of his actions. The mermaids surrounded him now, their mournful eyes fixed on him as they reached out with pale, translucent hands. Their fingers brushed his skin, sending cold shivers through his body. One of the spirits, the child, reached toward his face, her hand hovering just above his forehead. It is not enough to be sorry, she whispered. Only sacrifice will bring peace. And with that, the water surged forward, pulling him into its depths. Jacob's scream was swallowed by the river. The spirits, their faces filled with sorrow and rage, dragged him down into the cold, dark waters. The last thing he saw before the world was swallowed by darkness was Victoria's face, the face of the child he had failed, the face of the daughter he had promised to protect. And then everything went silent. The river, once a calm and mysterious body of water, now shimmered with an eerie glow that grew brighter than it ever had before. The currents were restless, swirling as if alive. The spirits of the mermaids lingered at the surface, their eyes filled with a sorrow that seemed endless. The village would never be the same. The forbidden river would remain a place of dread, its glow now a constant reminder of the curse that had claimed Jacob and the lives of many before him. And as the villagers continued to avoid the river, they would never forget the tale of Jacob, the fisherman who had ventured into the depths of the forbidden river and paid the ultimate price for his sin. The village of Delta City grew quiet in the days following Jacob's disappearance. The once bustling streets now felt empty, the air heavy with a tension that no one could escape. The elders gathered often, muttering in low voices, while the younger villagers stayed far from the river, eyes darting nervously when they passed its glowing shores. The curse, they believed, was still alive. Victoria, Jacob's daughter, was left to carry the weight of what had happened. Alone. She had lost both her father and her innocence in the space of a few short days. The other children had stopped talking to her. They whispered behind her back, calling her the daughter of the cursed fisherman. No one dared to be close to her, afraid that the curse would spread to them, just as it had claimed her father. But Victoria never stopped going to the river. Every day she walked to the riverbank, her small feet kicking up dust as she made her way to the forbidden place. The villagers stared at her from their windows, shaking their heads. "Victoria, why do you go there?" one of the elders asked her one afternoon. "Don't you see what it has done to your father?" Victoria looked up at the elder, her eyes bright with tears she refused to let fall. "Papa said it was the only way to make things right," she said softly. The elder frowned, but Victoria didn't wait for a response. She continued her walk to the river, where the eerie glow was always waiting for her. She stood at the edge, staring at the churning water, her heart heavy with confusion. She didn't know what had happened to her father. She didn't understand why the river had called to him and why it now seemed to call to her too. Days turned into weeks and the seasons began to change. The village tried to return to normal, but it never quite felt the same. The river's curse lingered in the air, a presence that couldn't be shaken. Victoria spent more and more time near the water, watching it glow as though it had become her only companion. The sadness that had once lived in her heart had grown into something else, something she couldn't name. One day as she sat by the river's edge, the water suddenly began to stir. The air grew cold and the ground beneath her feet trembled. Victoria's breath caught in her throat as the surface of the water rippled, and then, as if summoned by her very presence, the figures began to emerge again. The mermaids. But this time it wasn't the full chorus of mournful spirits. Only one emerged, Jacob's daughter. She was no longer a small, glowing child, but a woman, her long flowing hair shimmering in the water like a veil of silver. Her eyes, the same glowing eyes that Victoria had seen in her father's dreams, met hers, filled with an endless sorrow. "Your father paid the price," the mermaid spoke, her voice soft but filled with unearthly sadness. "He sacrificed himself to end the curse, but it is not over. The river will always call to you." Victoria stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. "What do you mean?" The mermaid's expression softened and she reached a hand out toward her. "You have inherited his sin, Victoria. The curse is not just his to bear, it is yours as well. It will follow you and it will take everything you love, just as it took your father." Victoria shook her head, her mind racing. No, I won't let it. I won't let it take me too." The mermaid's eyes glistened with an ancient understanding. "You cannot escape it," she whispered. "The river has claimed you just as it claimed him. You are its child now and its call will never leave you." That night Victoria returned to her small hut, her body heavy with the weight of the mermaid's words. She hadn't told anyone what had happened by the river, she couldn't. How could she explain what she had seen? How could she explain that the river had claimed her too? But as the night wore on, and the village fell into silence, Victoria heard it, the faintest of whispers, carried on the wind. "Come back to us." She stood at the window, her eyes drawn to the glow of the forbidden river. It beckoned to her, pulling her in with an irresistible force. Her father's voice echoed in her mind, the last words he had said to her before he disappeared. "Only sacrifice will bring peace." Victoria's heart clenched as the truth settled over her like a cold, suffocating blanket. She understood now. She understood what the mermaid had meant. The river hadn't taken her father by accident. It had chosen him. Just as it had chosen her. And now, to end the curse, she too would have to face it. The next morning, as the sun barely touched the horizon, Victoria stood once more by the river's edge. The water was calm now, but its glow was brighter than it had ever been, as if it knew she had come to fulfill the inevitable. The mermaids appeared, their mournful eyes fixed on her. The child, now a woman, stood at the front, her expression filled with sorrow. "You have come," the mermaid said softly, her voice like a song carried on the wind. Victoria nodded, though her heart was breaking. "I don't want to," she whispered. "But I understand now. I have to end it. For my father." The mermaid smiled gently. "You are brave, Victoria. Brave in a way your father could never be. The river will never forget him." Victoria stepped closer to the water, her feet sinking into the wet sand. The glow of the river surrounded her now, like a shroud of light. It was cold, but she didn't care. She could feel the pull of the river in her bones. She could hear it calling to her, just as it had called to her father. She closed her eyes and for a moment the world fell away. She could feel her body trembling as if the river itself was reaching into her soul. And then, as if it was all part of the river's design, Victoria stepped forward into the water, allowing it to claim her, just as it had claimed her father. The mermaids swam around her, their voices rising in a mournful chorus. And as Victoria disappeared beneath the waves, the river's glow shined brighter than it had ever before, blinding, all-encompassing and full of sorrow. The curse would live on.